If I tell you why I can never again look at a nun's habit the same way, why the sound of church bells makes my heart race, and why I spent 23 years of my life believing I was serving God when I was actually serving men who used His name to hide the most terrible sins, perhaps you'll understand why some doors should remain forever closed. Hello, my dear friends. My name is Catherine, but you can call me Sister Catherine, though I haven't worn that title in over 15 years now. I'm 74 years old, born here in Birmingham, England in 1950, and today I want to share with you a story I've kept buried in my soul for more than 2 decades. Today, I need to tell you about 23 years of my life that I thought were the most sacred, the most meaningful, the most blessed years I could ever live, only to discover in the most devastating way possible that they were built on lies, manipulation, and the systematic protection of monsters who wore the clothes of saints. Before I begin, I'd love to know where you're watching this video from. Please leave me your messages in the comments below. It warms this old heart to know my voice is reaching so many different corners of the world. And if you could leave that little thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, it helps this grandmother tremendously to continue sharing these stories that need to be told. You know that feeling when you're 17 years old and you think you found your calling in life? When everything seems to fall into place like pieces of a divine puzzle, and you're absolutely certain that God Himself has chosen you for something special? That's exactly how I felt in 1967 when I first walked through the doors of St. Mary's Convent in Manchester. I was young, idealistic, full of faith, and completely naive about the world I was entering. My childhood had been simple but happy. My father worked in a textile factory. My mother took care of our small home in the working-class neighborhood of Ancoats. We weren't wealthy, but we had love, we had faith, and we had each other. Every Sunday morning, rain or shine, our family would walk the 6 blocks to St. Patrick's Church, where Father Murphy would deliver sermons that seemed to speak directly to my young heart about service, sacrifice, and the beauty of dedicating one's life to God. I was different from other girls my age. While they dreamed of marriage, children, and domestic life, I dreamed of something bigger, something that felt more meaningful. I would spend hours in my small bedroom, kneeling before a wooden crucifix my grandmother had given me, praying for guidance, asking God to show me His plan for my life. The answer came when I was 16, during a particularly moving Easter service where Father Murphy spoke about the calling to religious life, about young women who chose to become brides of Christ rather than brides of earthly men. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt something stirring in my soul, a certainty I had never experienced before. This was my path. This was what God wanted for me. When I told my parents about my decision to enter the convent, my mother cried for 3 days straight. Not tears of joy, but tears of a mother who was losing her only daughter to a life she couldn't understand. My father, a man of few words, simply looked at me with sad eyes and said, "Catherine, are you absolutely sure this is what you want? Once you go down this path, there's no easy way back." But I was 17 and filled with the kind of certainty that only comes with youth and inexperience. Of course, I was sure. God had called me, and I would answer. In September 1967, carrying a small suitcase with my few possessions and my grandmother's crucifix, I entered St. Mary's Convent as a postulant. The building itself was imposing, built of gray stone with high walls that seemed to reach toward heaven itself. The Mother Superior, Mother Margaret, was a woman in her 60s with penetrating blue eyes and a voice that commanded instant respect and, if I'm honest, a little fear. The first months were a period of adjustment, unlike anything I had ever experienced. We rose at 4:30 every morning for lauds, the first prayer service of the day. The chapel was cold and dark, lit only by candles that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. We wore simple gray dresses, our heads covered, our voices joining in ancient Latin prayers that I was still learning to understand. After morning prayers, we had breakfast in complete silence, then spent the morning hours in study, learning about theology, church history, the lives of the saints, and the rules of our particular order. The afternoons were dedicated to work. Some sisters worked in the convent school, teaching children from the nearby villages. Others worked in the kitchens, the gardens, or the laundry. I was assigned to help Sister Agnes in the infirmary, caring for elderly sisters who had spent their entire lives in service and were now in their final years. It was challenging work, but I found it deeply meaningful. Here were women who had dedicated 60, 70, even 80 years of their lives to God, and I was honored to care for them in their time of need. The evenings were for personal prayer and reflection. We would gather again in the chapel for Vespers, the evening prayer service, and then have a simple dinner before retiring to our individual cells for private devotion. My cell was tiny, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a small wooden desk, and a wash basin. On the wall hung a simple wooden cross, and beneath it, my grandmother's crucifix that had followed me from home. Those early months were a mixture of challenge and profound spiritual experience. The life was harsh, demanding, completely different from anything I had known. We owned nothing individually, wore identical clothes, ate simple food, had no entertainment, no distractions from the outside world. But there was something beautiful about the simplicity, the focus, the sense of being part of something ancient and sacred. During my personal prayer times, I felt closer to God than I ever had in my life. After 18 months as a postulant, I was accepted as a novice. This was a significant step, marked by a ceremony where I received my religious habit for the first time. I remember standing before the mirror in the small changing room, looking at myself in the black and white habit of our order, the white veil that marked me as a novice. I felt transformed, chosen, special. Mother Margaret performed the ceremony, placing the veil on my head and saying the words that would echo in my memory for decades to come. "Catherine, you are now a bride of Christ. Your life belongs to Him and to His church. May you serve with humility, obedience, and perfect devotion." The 2 years of novitiate were intense. We studied more deeply, took on greater responsibilities, and were gradually introduced to aspects of convent life that postulants weren't privy to. I excelled in my studies, particularly in theology and canon law. My superiors praised my devotion, my intelligence, and my willingness to take on difficult tasks. I was chosen to help with administrative duties, keeping records, corresponding with other convents, managing some of the financial aspects of our daily life. It was during this period that I first began to notice things that didn't quite sit right with me. Small things at first, the way certain sisters seemed to have special privileges, better food, private meetings with visiting priests that the rest of us weren't included in. The way questions about certain policies or practices were discouraged, sometimes quite harshly. The emphasis on absolute obedience, not just to God, but to the human authority structure of the church. But I pushed these concerns aside. After all, who was I, a young novice, to question an institution that had been serving God for centuries? If there were things I didn't understand, surely it was because of my own spiritual immaturity, my lack of experience, my pride that needed to be crushed through humble obedience. In August 1970, at the age of 20, I took my first vows. It was one of the most significant days of my life. In a beautiful ceremony attended by my parents, my few relatives, and the entire convent community, I vowed poverty, chastity, and obedience. I promised to live according to the rule of our order, to serve God and His church with my entire life. As I spoke those words, as I felt the weight of the permanent veil placed on my head, replacing the white novice veil, I was absolutely certain I was exactly where God wanted me to be. My first assignment as a fully professed sister was to teach at St. Mary's School, which was attached to our convent. I taught mathematics and religious education to girls between the ages of 12 and 16. I loved the work. The girls were bright, curious, eager to learn. I felt I was making a real difference in their lives, not just academically, but spiritually. I could see myself growing as a teacher, as a spiritual guide, as a woman of God. The school was run by Sister Elizabeth, a woman in her 40s who had been at the convent for over 20 years. She was strict but fair, demanding but caring. Under her leadership, the school had an excellent reputation in the region. Parents from wealthy families would send their daughters to us, knowing they would receive not only a superior education, but also strong moral formation. It was also during this time that I began to develop a closer relationship with Father Thomas, who served as chaplain for both the convent and the school. Father Thomas was in his mid-30s, a brilliant theologian who had studied in Rome and spoke 6 languages fluently. He celebrated our daily masses, heard our confessions, and provided spiritual direction to the sisters. He was charming, intellectually stimulating, and seemed to take a special interest in my spiritual development. Father Thomas would often call me to his office to discuss theological questions, to give me special books to read, to talk about my growth as a religious sister. These conversations were intellectually exciting for me. Coming from a working-class family, I had never had access to the kind of sophisticated theological education he could provide. He introduced me to the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, the great mystics of the Church. He encouraged me to think deeply about complex spiritual matters. Looking back now, I can see warning signs that I completely missed at the time. The way he would find excuses to touch my hand or shoulder during our conversations. The way he would ask detailed questions about my personal struggles with celibacy, framing them as necessary for spiritual direction, but dwelling on intimate details that made me uncomfortable. The way he would give me special privileges, excusing me from certain duties so I could spend more time in study or prayer. But I was young, inexperienced, and had been taught that priests were representatives of Christ on earth, that their guidance was to be trusted, absolutely. When he told me I had a special calling, that I was more spiritually mature than other sisters my age, that God had special plans for me, I believed him completely. When he began to suggest that our relationship was blessed by God, that the feelings I was developing for him were part of a deeper spiritual journey, I wanted desperately to believe that was true. The transformation from innocent spiritual direction to something much darker was so gradual that I didn't recognize it until it was too late. Private prayer sessions in his office that would last for hours. Conversations about the mystical marriage between the soul and God that became increasingly personal and intimate. His insistence that what happened between us in the context of spiritual direction was sacred, blessed by God, and must never be shared with anyone else. Is this story resonating with anyone watching? Have you found yourself in situations where your trust was violated by people you believed were representatives of God? I see your comments, and I want you to know you're not alone. By my third year as a fully professed sister, what had begun as spiritual direction with Father Thomas had evolved into something I didn't have words for. I was 23 years old, had lived in the convent since I was 17, and my understanding of relationships, of boundaries, of what was normal and healthy, had been completely shaped by this isolated religious environment where questioning authority was considered a sin, and absolute obedience was the highest virtue. Father Thomas had convinced me that our special relationship was a mystical gift from God, a deeper form of spiritual communion that only the most advanced souls could understand. He would quote obscure passages from medieval mystics about the soul's union with the divine, about how sometimes God worked through human instruments in ways that seemed unconventional to those who lacked spiritual maturity. When I expressed doubts or discomfort about our increasingly intimate encounters, he would remind me of the great saints who had been misunderstood, who had to suffer in silence because their spiritual experiences were too profound for ordinary minds to comprehend. The manipulation was so sophisticated, so wrapped in theological language and spiritual authority, that I genuinely believed I was experiencing something sacred, even when every fiber of my being was screaming that something was terribly wrong. He had isolated me from the other sisters by convincing me that I was special, chosen, operating on a higher spiritual plane than they could understand. When Sister Mary Catherine, who had been my closest friend during our novitiate, tried to express concern about the amount of time I was spending in private meetings with Father Thomas, I actually felt sorry for her spiritual immaturity. The other sisters began to notice changes in me. I was withdrawn, anxious, constantly exhausted from the emotional turmoil I was carrying alone. My teaching suffered as I struggled to concentrate on lessons while my mind was consumed with confusion about what was happening to me. The bright, enthusiastic young sister who had taken her vows 3 years earlier was disappearing, replaced by someone who moved through the daily routines of convent life like a ghost. Mother Margaret called me to her office one autumn morning in 1973. I remember the date precisely because it was the feast day of St. Teresa of Avila, and I had been praying desperately to this great mystic for guidance about my situation. Mother Margaret was a formidable woman, someone who had run the convent with an iron fist for over 15 years. Nothing happened within these walls without her knowledge or approval. "Sister Catherine," she said in her clipped, authoritative voice, "I've been observing you closely these past months, and I'm concerned about your spiritual state. You seem distracted, troubled, distant from your sisters and your duties. Is there something you need to confess?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Here was my opportunity to tell someone in authority about what had been happening with Father Thomas, to seek help, to find a way out of the confusion and shame that had been consuming me. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I heard Father Thomas's voice in my head, reminding me that our relationship was a sacred secret, that revealing it would be a betrayal of God's special plan for my spiritual development. "Mother, I've been struggling with some spiritual dryness in my prayer life," I said, using the safe language of religious experience that I knew she would understand and accept. "Perhaps I need additional spiritual direction to help me through this difficult period." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through my carefully chosen words. "Sister Catherine, spiritual dryness is a common experience in religious life, but what I'm observing in you seems to be something different. You're not just experiencing a dark night of the soul. You're exhibiting signs of someone carrying a burden that's too heavy for you to bear alone." For a moment, I almost broke down and told her everything. But then she continued, "However, I want you to know that the reputation of this convent, the respect we've earned in this community, the trust that parents place in us when they send their daughters to our school, all of these things depend on the absolute discretion and proper behavior of every sister under this roof. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" The message was clear, even if it wasn't stated directly. Whatever was troubling me, whatever secrets I might be carrying, the institution came first. The reputation of the convent, the authority of the church, the maintenance of public trust were more important than my individual struggles or pain. I nodded silently and left her office feeling more isolated than ever. That winter, something happened that would change the trajectory of my entire life. A new student arrived at our school, a girl named Rebecca, who was 14 years old. She had been sent to us by wealthy parents who were traveling abroad for business and wanted their daughter to receive a proper Catholic education in their absence. Rebecca was bright, curious, and reminded me so much of myself at that age, full of questions about faith, about God, about the meaning of life. Father Thomas took an immediate interest in Rebecca, just as he had taken an interest in me years earlier. He began calling her to his office for special spiritual guidance sessions. He assigned her additional reading materials. He praised her spiritual maturity and told her she had a special calling that set her apart from the other students. I watched this happening with a growing sense of horror, recognizing the exact same pattern of grooming that I had experienced. The difference was that now I was older, more experienced, and could see the manipulation from the outside. What I had interpreted as special spiritual attention when it was happening to me, I could now recognize as predatory behavior when I saw it directed at a child. The theological justifications, the emphasis on secrecy, the gradual boundary violations, the isolation from peers, all of it was a carefully orchestrated system of abuse dressed up in religious language. I began to pay closer attention to Rebecca, watching for signs of the confusion and distress that I remembered so well from my own experience. Sure enough, within a few weeks of beginning her special sessions with Father Thomas, she began to exhibit the same symptoms I had shown: withdrawal from other students, anxiety, difficulty concentrating on her studies, a haunted look in her eyes that no 14-year-old should ever have. One evening after dinner, I found Rebecca crying alone in the school chapel. She was kneeling before the altar, her small shoulders shaking with sobs that she was trying to muffle. I approached her quietly and sat down in the pew behind her. "Rebecca," I said softly, "is there something troubling you? Sometimes it helps to talk about what's bothering us." She turned to look at me with eyes that seemed far older than her 14 years. "Sister Catherine, can I ask you something? Is it normal for priests to want to discuss very personal things during spiritual direction? Things about feelings and bodies and—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. I knew exactly what she was trying to ask, because I had once been in her position, confused and afraid, and desperately seeking reassurance that what was happening to her was normal and holy. "Rebecca," I said, choosing my words very carefully. Spiritual direction should help you grow closer to God and feel more peaceful in your faith. If your sessions with Father Thomas are making you feel confused or uncomfortable or scared, then something is not right, no matter what anyone tells you. Her eyes filled with tears again. But he says that God has chosen me for something special, that I'm more spiritually advanced than other girls my age, and that's why he needs to prepare me in ways that they wouldn't understand. He says if I tell anyone about our conversations, it would show that I'm not really ready for the special calling God has for me. Hearing my own experience reflected back to me through this child's words was like being struck by lightning. The carefully constructed justifications that Father Thomas had used to manipulate me, the spiritual language he had used to normalize abuse, the threats disguised as concern for my spiritual development, all of it became crystal clear when I heard it applied to someone else. That night, I made a decision that would cost me everything I thought I valued in life, but would ultimately save my soul and protect an innocent child. I decided to break my silence and report what was happening, regardless of the consequences. But before I continue with what happened next, I want to pause and connect with all of you who are watching this video. I can see from your comments that this story is touching hearts all over the world, from America to Australia, from Canada to South Africa. It means everything to me to know that my voice is reaching people who need to hear this message. You know what I've learned over the years? The most powerful thing we can do is simply witness each other's truth. When someone finds the courage to share their story of surviving abuse, manipulation, or betrayal by people in positions of trust, the most healing response we can offer is simply, I believe you. Your experience matters. You are not alone. If this story is bringing up memories of your own experiences with religious authority figures who violated your trust, please know that what happened to you was not your fault. It doesn't matter how spiritual or holy they seemed. It doesn't matter what religious language they used to justify their behavior. It doesn't matter if other people believed them instead of you. What matters is your truth, your healing, and your courage to keep living despite the damage they caused. And if you're currently in a situation where someone in religious authority is making you uncomfortable, pushing boundaries, asking you to keep secrets, or telling you that you're special in ways that feel wrong, please trust your instincts. God does not work through people who make you feel ashamed, scared, or confused about your own worth and dignity. I need your support to keep sharing these difficult but necessary stories. If this video is helping you in some way, would you take just a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell? Not because I need the numbers, but because every subscription helps these stories reach someone who desperately needs to hear them. Someone who is sitting in silence, carrying shame that doesn't belong to them, believing they're the only person who has ever experienced something like this. Leave me a comment and let me know you're there. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if this story resonates with your own experience. Tell me what gives you strength when facing difficult truths. We're building a community here of people who refuse to let abuse hide behind religious authority, and every voice matters. Next week, I'll continue this story and tell you about what happened when I finally found the courage to speak up, how the institution I had devoted my life to responded to my attempts to protect a child, and how I learned that sometimes doing the right thing costs us everything we thought we wanted, but gives us back something far more valuable, our integrity and our freedom. Until then, keep your hearts open to truth, even when it's painful, and remember that you are worthy of love, respect, and protection, no matter what anyone in religious authority may have told you otherwise. The morning I decided to report Father Thomas's abuse of Rebecca was October 15th, 1973. I remember the date so clearly because it was the feast of Saint Teresa of Avila, the great mystic who wrote about the soul's journey toward God through suffering and purification. As I knelt in the chapel before dawn, praying for courage, I thought about how Teresa had faced persecution from church authorities who questioned her visions and experiences. I had no idea that I was about to begin my own journey of persecution, not for claiming mystical experiences, but for trying to protect a child from a predator who wore the collar of a priest. My first step was to document everything I could remember about my own experiences with Father Thomas, and everything I had observed regarding his behavior with Rebecca. I wrote it all down in a small notebook that I kept hidden beneath my mattress, recording dates, times, locations, specific conversations, and the gradual escalation of inappropriate behavior. Reading my own words on paper made the reality of what had happened impossible to deny or minimize. This wasn't spiritual direction gone slightly off course. This was systematic grooming and abuse by a man who used his religious authority to manipulate and exploit vulnerable young women and girls. I knew I needed to go to Mother Margaret first, following the proper chain of authority within our religious community. But I also knew from our previous conversation that her primary concern would be protecting the reputation of the convent rather than protecting the victims of abuse. Still, I had to try. I requested a private meeting and spent hours preparing what I would say, how I would present the evidence, what arguments I would make to convince her to take action. The meeting took place in Mother Margaret's office, an austere room dominated by a large wooden crucifix and portraits of previous Mother Superiors dating back to the founding of our order. She listened to my account with an expression that grew increasingly stern as I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for several long minutes, her fingers drumming impatiently on her wooden desk. "Sister Catherine," she finally said, her voice cold and controlled, "these are extremely serious accusations you're making against a priest of God. Father Thomas has been serving this community faithfully for over 5 years. He has an impeccable reputation, excellent references from his previous assignments, and the complete trust of the diocesan authorities. What you're describing sounds more like the fantasies of a troubled young woman than the actions of a dedicated servant of Christ." I had expected skepticism, but the dismissive tone and the immediate assumption that I was lying or delusional still hit me like a physical blow. "Mother, I have specific details, dates, patterns of behavior that I can document, and it's not just about me anymore. He's now targeting Rebecca, and she's only 14 years old. We have a responsibility to protect her." Her eyes flashed with something that looked like anger, but also fear. "Sister Catherine, you need to be very careful about the path you're choosing here. Accusations like this can destroy lives, damage the Church's reputation in this community, and cause scandal that could affect our school's enrollment and our convent's financial stability. Are you absolutely certain that what you interpreted as inappropriate behavior wasn't simply misunderstood pastoral care?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about where her priorities lay. She wasn't asking whether Father Thomas was guilty of abuse. She was asking whether I was willing to reconsider my interpretation of events in order to avoid causing problems for the institution. This was my first real introduction to how religious organizations handle allegations of abuse, by pressuring victims to doubt their own experiences and prioritizing institutional protection over individual safety. "Mother, I know the difference between pastoral care and sexual abuse," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the trembling I felt throughout my body. "And even if you don't believe my account of what happened to me, surely you can see that Rebecca is exhibiting clear signs of distress. At minimum, shouldn't we limit Father Thomas's access to her until we can investigate further?" Mother Margaret stood up from her chair, a clear signal that our conversation was over. "Sister Catherine, I want you to spend the next week in prayer and reflection, asking God to help you examine your conscience and your motivations. Sometimes when we're struggling with our own spiritual lives, we can project our problems onto others and see darkness where there is actually light. I'll be praying for you, and I hope you'll come to realize that these accusations stem from your own spiritual confusion rather than any actual wrongdoing by Father Thomas." I left that meeting feeling more isolated and desperate than ever. The woman I had trusted to protect the sisters under her care had essentially accused me of being either mentally unstable or maliciously dishonest. But worse than her disbelief was the clear message that even if she did believe me, she would still prioritize the institution's reputation over our safety. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of spending the week in prayer and reflection as Mother Margaret had instructed, I decided to contact the diocesan authorities directly. If the convent wouldn't protect us, perhaps the bishop would. I wrote a detailed letter to Bishop Williams, outlining my experiences with Father Thomas and my concerns about Rebecca's safety. I included specific dates, locations, and descriptions of inappropriate behavior, hoping that presenting concrete evidence would make it impossible for church authorities to dismiss my allegations. 3 weeks passed before I received a response. During that time, I watched helplessly as Rebecca continued to deteriorate. She was losing weight, falling asleep during classes, and had stopped participating in the social activities that had once brought her joy. Other students began to notice her withdrawal and started asking questions that I couldn't answer without violating her privacy or revealing information that could make her situation worse. When Bishop Williams's response finally arrived, it was a single paragraph that destroyed any remaining faith I had in the church hierarchy's willingness to address clerical abuse. He thanked me for my letter, assured me that Father Thomas was a priest in good standing with no history of complaints, and suggested that I speak with my Mother Superior about arranging additional spiritual counseling to help me work through what he called my spiritual difficulties and confused emotional state. The bishop had not only dismissed my allegations without investigation, but had also clearly communicated with Mother Margaret about my letter, violating any pretense of confidential reporting. I was now marked as a troublemaker, a sister who had gone outside proper channels to make false accusations against a respected priest. My isolation within the convent became even more pronounced as other sisters began to avoid me, whether out of suspicion about my mental state or fear of being associated with someone who had fallen out of favor with the authorities. It was around this time that I began to understand how institutional systems protect abusers while silencing victims. The emphasis on hierarchy and obedience that I had once seen as holy virtues were actually tools of control that made it nearly impossible for people at the bottom of the power structure to challenge those above them. The language of forgiveness and reconciliation that I had thought was about Christian mercy was actually being used to pressure victims to remain silent and avoid causing scandal. But understanding the system didn't make me any less determined to protect Rebecca. If the church authorities wouldn't act, I would have to find another way. I began documenting Father Thomas's interactions with Rebecca more carefully, noting when he called her to his office, how long their meetings lasted, and what her emotional state was before and after these encounters. I also started paying attention to his behavior with other students, looking for patterns that might indicate he was targeting additional victims. What I discovered was even worse than I had feared. Father Thomas had a clear preference for girls who were isolated, vulnerable, or struggling with family problems. Rebecca fit this profile perfectly as a girl whose parents had essentially abandoned her to our care while they pursued their business interests abroad. But she wasn't the only one. I identified at least 3 other students who were receiving his special attention, all of them exhibiting the same signs of confusion and distress that I remembered from my own experience. The realization that multiple children were being victimized while I struggled to convince adults to take action filled me with a rage and determination I had never experienced before. This wasn't just about my own trauma anymore, or even about Rebecca specifically. This was about a predator who was systematically abusing his position of trust to harm children while hiding behind the authority and protection of the Catholic Church. I made another decision that would ultimately cost me everything I thought I valued in my religious life. I decided to go directly to the parents of the girls I believed were being targeted. This meant violating every protocol of religious life, going against direct orders from my superiors, and risking immediate expulsion from the convent. But I could no longer prioritize institutional loyalty over child protection. My first conversation was with Rebecca's aunt, her closest relative in England, who had been designated as her local guardian. I arranged to meet her privately during one of her monthly visits to the school. When I told her about my concerns regarding Father Thomas's inappropriate behavior with Rebecca, her reaction was immediate and protective in a way that the church authorities' responses had never been. "Sister Catherine, are you telling me that this priest has been sexually abusing my niece?" she asked, her voice sharp with alarm and anger. "I'm telling you that Rebecca is exhibiting clear signs of distress related to private meetings she's been having with Father Thomas, and that his behavior with her follows the same pattern I experienced when I was receiving spiritual direction from him several years ago," I replied, trying to be precise and truthful without making accusations I couldn't definitively prove. She immediately demanded to speak with Rebecca privately, and within hours had removed her from the school permanently. Before leaving, she told me that she would be contacting both the police and her solicitor about pursuing criminal charges against Father Thomas. She also said something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. "Sister Catherine, I don't know what it will cost you to have told me this, but I want you to know that you may have saved my niece from years of trauma. Whatever happens to you as a result, you did the right thing." Within 48 hours of Rebecca's departure, I was summoned to face a disciplinary tribunal consisting of Mother Margaret, the diocesan representative, and Father Thomas himself. The irony of having my abuser sit in judgment of my attempts to protect his victims was not lost on me. But it was also a perfect illustration of how power structures protect themselves by allowing perpetrators to participate in investigating their own crimes. The tribunal was a mockery of justice from beginning to end. I was accused of violating my vows of obedience by going against direct orders from my superiors, of causing scandal by making false accusations against a priest, and of damaging the reputation of both the convent and the church through my reckless behavior. Father Thomas sat through the entire proceeding with an expression of hurt innocence, occasionally shaking his head sadly as if he were witnessing the tragic downfall of a once promising young sister. When given the opportunity to defend myself, I tried to explain my motivations and present the evidence I had gathered. But every piece of documentation was dismissed as the product of a disturbed imagination. Every pattern of behavior was reinterpreted as normal pastoral care that I had misunderstood due to my own spiritual and emotional problems. The verdict was predetermined. I was to be expelled from the religious community immediately, with no opportunity for appeal or reconsideration. My 23 years of religious life, my vows, my entire adult identity were being erased because I had tried to protect children from a predator who wore the clothes of a priest. As I packed my few personal belongings that evening, preparing to leave the only home I had known for over 6 years, I felt a mixture of devastation and relief that I couldn't fully understand at the time. I was losing everything I thought gave my life meaning and purpose, but I was also escaping from a system that had revealed itself to be fundamentally corrupt and more concerned with protecting abusers than victims. Walking through the gates of St. Mary's Convent for the last time on November 3, 1973, carrying a single suitcase containing everything I owned in the world, I felt like I was stepping off the edge of a cliff into complete darkness. At 23 years old, I had spent my entire adult life within those walls, and before that, my adolescence had been focused entirely on preparing for religious life. I had no idea how to live in the secular world, no marketable skills beyond teaching in a Catholic school that would never hire me now. No money beyond the £20 Mother Margaret had grudgingly given me as charity, and no family support since my parents had essentially disowned me when news of my expulsion reached them. The small bed and breakfast where I spent my first week of freedom was run by Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, a widow in her 60s who rented rooms to travelers passing through Manchester. When I appeared at her door with my nun's suitcase and civilian clothes that clearly didn't fit properly, she took one look at me and seemed to understand immediately that I was someone in crisis, though she was too polite to ask for details. "You look like someone who's lost everything and doesn't know where to go next," she said kindly, showing me to a small but clean room on the second floor. "I've seen that look before, dear. Life has a way of turning upside down when we least expect it, but it also has a way of working out if we give it time and don't give up hope." Those first weeks were the most disorienting and terrifying of my life. I had to learn how to do things that most people take for granted: managing money, shopping for food, navigating public transportation, applying for jobs, interacting with strangers without the protection of a religious habit that immediately defined my place in the world. Everything felt foreign and overwhelming. I would lie awake at night in that unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the city that I had been isolated from for so many years, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake in choosing to protect Rebecca rather than preserve my religious vocation. The job search was particularly humiliating. My only qualification was a teaching certificate that was useless without references, and the few schools that were willing to interview me seemed more interested in the scandal surrounding my departure from the convent than in my actual abilities as an educator. Word had spread quickly through the local Catholic community about the sister who had made false accusations against a priest and been expelled for her troublemaking. In a city where the Catholic Church wielded significant social and economic influence, Being branded as someone who attacked clergy was essentially a mark of permanent unemployability. After 3 weeks of rejections, I was running dangerously low on money and beginning to panic about how I would survive. It was Mrs. Henderson who saved me, though she did it in such a casual way that it took me years to fully appreciate the kindness she showed a stranger in desperate need. "Catherine," she said one morning over breakfast, "I've been thinking about hiring someone to help me with the cleaning and maintenance around here. The work isn't glamorous, but it pays enough to cover room and board plus a small salary. Would you be interested in something like that while you figure out your next steps?" I accepted immediately, grateful beyond words for any opportunity to earn money and maintain my shelter. The work was indeed unglamorous: scrubbing bathrooms, changing linens, washing dishes, maintaining the small garden behind the building, and helping with the endless repairs that an old building required. But it was honest work, and Mrs. Henderson treated me with dignity and respect, never prying into my past or making me feel ashamed of my circumstances. Working alongside Mrs. Henderson also gave me my first real education in how the secular world operated. She had been running her business for over 15 years, ever since her husband died and left her with a mortgage she couldn't afford on a widow's pension. She had learned to be independent, resourceful, and pragmatic in ways that my sheltered religious life had never required. Watching her navigate challenges, make decisions, and take responsibility for her own life began to teach me things about personal autonomy that I had never learned in the convent. But the most important part of my healing during this period came from an unexpected source: the other women who occasionally stayed at Mrs. Henderson's establishment. Because the bed and breakfast was affordable and discreet, it attracted women who were in transition for various reasons. Some were escaping abusive marriages, others were starting over after divorces, and a few were, like me, refugees from religious communities who had lost their vocations for various reasons. It was through conversations with these women that I began to understand I wasn't alone in having suffered abuse at the hands of religious authority figures. Sarah, a woman in her 30s who had fled an abusive marriage to a deacon in her church, told me stories about how her husband used biblical verses about wives submitting to their husbands to justify his violence, and how church leaders consistently sided with him whenever she sought help. Margaret, a former Anglican nun who had left her community after witnessing systematic financial corruption, described the same patterns of institutional protection and victim blaming that I had experienced. When she tried to report the misuse of donated funds, she was accused of being disloyal, ungrateful, and spiritually prideful for questioning her superiors. Linda, who had been sexually abused by her parish priest when she was 16, told me about years of being told by church authorities that she had misunderstood his intentions, that she was too sensitive, that she needed to forgive and forget for the good of the community. She had carried shame and self-doubt for decades before finally accepting that the abuse was real and that the responsibility lay entirely with her abuser, not with her. These conversations were revelatory for me. I began to see that my experience with Father Thomas and the institutional response to my reports were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic pattern of how religious organizations handled accusations of abuse. The emphasis on protecting the institution's reputation over individual victims, the use of spiritual language to manipulate and silence, the tendency to blame victims for misunderstanding or provoking their abusers, all of this was standard operating procedure rather than unique failures in my particular case. Understanding this pattern was both liberating and enraging. Liberating because it helped me stop blaming myself for the abuse and for the institutional betrayal that followed. I could see clearly that the problem wasn't my spiritual immaturity, my oversensitivity, or my lack of forgiveness. The problem was a system that prioritized protecting powerful men over vulnerable women and children. But it was also enraging because it meant that Rebecca and I were just two victims among potentially thousands, and that the same patterns were likely playing out in religious communities around the world. 6 months after leaving the convent, I received a letter that would change the trajectory of my new life. It was from Rebecca's aunt, informing me that their family's investigation into Father Thomas had uncovered evidence of abuse involving multiple victims spanning several years. The police had opened a formal investigation. Criminal charges were being filed, and several other families had come forward with similar allegations once they learned it was safe to speak up. The letter also contained an invitation that surprised me. Rebecca's aunt was involved with a newly formed organization that provided support services for survivors of clerical abuse and their families. They were looking for someone with insider knowledge of how religious institutions operated to help develop educational programs and advocacy strategies. Would I be interested in discussing a potential position with their organization? The idea of turning my traumatic experience into a tool for helping other survivors was immediately appealing, but it also terrified me. Taking such a position would mean publicly identifying myself as a victim of clerical abuse, permanently closing any possibility of returning to religious life, and probably ensuring that I would never be welcome in traditional Catholic communities again. But it would also mean that my suffering could serve a purpose beyond my own healing. I spent weeks thinking and praying about this opportunity, seeking guidance not from church authorities who had proven themselves untrustworthy, but from my own conscience and from the examples of courage I had witnessed in the women I was living alongside. Mrs. Henderson, characteristically practical, helped me think through the decision by asking simple questions. What would you regret more, Catherine? Taking a risk that might not work out, or staying safe and wondering for the rest of your life what might have been possible if you had been brave enough to try? In June 1974, I accepted the position with the Survivor Advocacy Organization and began what would become my life's work, helping other victims of religious abuse find their voices, navigate legal and therapeutic resources, and rebuild their lives after institutional betrayal. The work was challenging, often heartbreaking, but deeply meaningful in ways that my previous religious vocation had never been. My first major project was developing educational materials for parents and community members about how to recognize signs of grooming and abuse by religious authority figures. Drawing on my own experience and the stories of dozens of other survivors, I created presentations that explained the sophisticated manipulation techniques that predators use, the institutional dynamics that enable abuse to continue, and the steps that communities could take to better protect children and vulnerable adults. The response to these educational programs was mixed, but ultimately encouraging. Many parents and community leaders were grateful for information that helped them better protect the children in their care. But I also faced significant resistance from religious communities that saw my work as an attack on faith itself, rather than an attempt to hold abusive individuals and institutions accountable. Some of the most vitriolic opposition came from people I had once considered friends and spiritual siblings. Former sisters from my convent would cross the street to avoid speaking to me when they saw me in town. Priests who had once praised my devotion now described me from their pulpits as a bitter, disturbed woman who was attacking the church out of vindictiveness and spiritual confusion. But for every voice that condemned my work, there were others that encouraged it. Survivors who had carried shame and silence for decades began reaching out to share their stories and seek support. Parents who had struggled to get religious institutions to take their concerns seriously found validation and practical guidance through our programs. Legal advocates working on abuse cases consulted with our organization to better understand the dynamics they were dealing with. Most importantly, changes began happening in some religious communities as awareness grew about the realities of institutional abuse. Policies were developed requiring background checks for anyone working with children. Training programs were implemented to help clergy and religious leaders recognize inappropriate behavior and respond appropriately to allegations. Some institutions even began acknowledging past failures and taking steps toward accountability and reform. The vindication I felt when Father Thomas was finally convicted and sentenced to prison was complex and bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it had taken years of fighting institutional resistance and victim blaming to achieve. How many other children might have been protected if the first reports had been taken seriously rather than dismissed and covered up? How many other predators were still operating under the protection of religious authority because institutions prioritized their reputations over child safety? By 1980, 7 years after leaving the convent, I had built a new life that felt more authentic and purposeful than anything I had experienced during my years as a religious sister. I had meaningful work that made a real difference in people's lives, genuine friendships based on mutual respect rather than institutional hierarchy, and a sense of personal agency that I had never been allowed to develop within the confines of religious obedience. I had also developed a more mature and nuanced understanding of spirituality that wasn't dependent on institutional approval or mediated by human authorities who might have their own agendas. My relationship with God became more personal, more questioning, more honest about the complexities and contradictions of faith in a world where religious institutions could simultaneously inspire great good and enable terrible harm. As I sit here today at 74 years old, looking back on the 51 years that have passed since I walked out of St. Mary's Convent, I can honestly say that losing everything I thought I wanted gave me everything I actually needed. The life I built after leaving religious life has been richer, more meaningful, and more genuinely spiritual than anything I experienced during my 23 years as a sister. But the path to this understanding was long, difficult, and required me to rebuild not just my external circumstances, but my entire understanding of faith, purpose, and what it means to serve God. By 1985, 12 years after my expulsion from the convent, the survivor advocacy organization I had helped establish had grown into a nationally recognized resource for victims of religious abuse and their families. We had assisted hundreds of survivors in finding legal representation, therapeutic support, and community resources. We had trained thousands of parents, teachers, and community leaders to recognize warning signs of institutional abuse and respond appropriately when concerns arose. Most importantly, we had helped shift public conversation about clerical abuse from whispered rumors and covered-up scandals to open dialogue about accountability and prevention. But the work took a personal toll that I hadn't fully anticipated when I first committed to this path. Listening to story after story of betrayal, manipulation, and institutional cover-ups was emotionally exhausting. Many nights I would come home from the office and cry for hours, not just for the survivors I was trying to help, but for my own lost innocence, for the faith I had once held so purely, for the years I had spent serving an institution that I now knew was fundamentally corrupted by its refusal to prioritize victim protection over reputation management. Mrs. Henderson, who had become like a mother to me during those early years of transition, was the person who finally convinced me that I needed professional help to process my own trauma while trying to help others heal from theirs. "Catherine," she said one evening when she found me crying at the kitchen table after a particularly difficult day, "you can't pour from an empty cup, dear. You've been so focused on helping other people heal that you haven't given yourself permission to grieve what you lost and work through what was done to you." Finding a therapist who understood religious trauma was challenging in the 1980s, when most mental health professionals had little training in the specific dynamics of institutional abuse or the complex psychological effects of leaving high-control religious environments. But I eventually found Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specialized in working with former members of various religious communities and understood the unique challenges we faced in rebuilding our identities outside the institutions that had once defined our entire sense of self. Therapy was initially more difficult than I had expected. For years, I had focused so intensely on helping other survivors that I had avoided fully confronting my own feelings about what Father Thomas had done to me and how the church hierarchy had responded to my attempts to seek help. I had intellectualized my experience, analyzed it as a case study in institutional dysfunction, but I hadn't allowed myself to feel the full weight of the betrayal, the violation, and the abandonment I had experienced. Dr. Williams helped me understand that my pattern of throwing myself into helping others while avoiding my own emotional needs was itself a form of survival mechanism, a way of finding meaning and purpose after my entire world had been shattered. But she also helped me see that true healing required me to acknowledge and work through my own trauma, not just as a professional expert on institutional abuse, but as a human being who had been deeply wounded by people she trusted. The breakthrough in my healing came during a therapy session in 1987, 14 years after leaving the convent, when Dr. Williams asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Catherine, when you think about that young woman who tried so hard to serve God faithfully, who believed so completely in the goodness of the institution she had devoted her life to, who suffered abuse and then institutional betrayal when she tried to protect a child. What do you want to say to her? For the first time in all those years, I allowed myself to feel genuine compassion for the 23-year-old sister who had walked out of that convent carrying nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of confusion and pain. I had been so focused on analyzing what had happened, on turning my experience into something useful for other people, that I had never simply acknowledged how much courage it had taken to speak up when everyone in authority was telling me to stay silent. I want to tell her that she was brave, I said through tears that felt like they came from a place I had kept locked away for years. I want to tell her that she did the right thing, even when it cost her everything. I want to tell her that God saw her courage and her love for that child, even when the people who claimed to represent God rejected her and cast her out. That session marked a turning point in my personal healing and in my professional work. I began to approach survivor advocacy not just as an expert helping clients, but as a fellow traveler on the path of recovery from religious trauma. This shift made me more effective in my work because I could speak from authentic experience of what it meant to rebuild faith, identity, and purpose after institutional betrayal. It also opened up new possibilities for my personal life that I had never allowed myself to consider. During my years in the convent, I had been taught that romantic relationships were incompatible with spiritual devotion, that choosing human love meant rejecting divine love. Even after leaving religious life, I had carried this conditioning with me, focusing entirely on my work and assuming that I had missed my chance for the kind of intimate partnership that most people take for granted. But in 1989, I met David Richardson, a journalist who was writing a series of articles about institutional responses to abuse allegations in various religious denominations. He interviewed me for his research, and what began as a professional conversation evolved into a friendship that gradually deepened into something more profound. David had his own complicated relationship with organized religion, having grown up in a fundamentalist Christian family that had rejected him when he began asking difficult questions about biblical interpretation and church authority. Our shared experience of losing religious communities that had once been central to our identities created a foundation of understanding that made it possible for both of us to risk vulnerability in ways we had never been able to before. David understood why I sometimes woke up from nightmares about being trapped in the convent. I understood why he still felt anxious when passing certain churches that reminded him of the rigid fundamentalism of his childhood. We married in 1991 in a small civil ceremony attended by Mrs. Henderson, several colleagues from the advocacy organization, and a handful of survivor friends who had become like family to me over the years. It wasn't the grand church wedding I had once dreamed of as a young girl, but it was more meaningful because it represented a choice made freely, without institutional pressure or expectations, based purely on love and mutual respect. Marriage taught me things about intimacy, trust, and spiritual partnership that I could never have learned within the celibate walls of religious life. David and I developed our own forms of spiritual practice that honored our faith while remaining independent of institutional authority. We read scripture together, not through the lens of official church interpretation, but as seekers trying to understand what divine love might actually look like in daily life. We prayed together, not reciting formal liturgies, but speaking honestly about our hopes, fears, gratitude, and concerns. By the late 1990s, our advocacy organization had become a model for similar groups in other countries, and I found myself traveling internationally to help establish support networks for survivors of religious abuse in various cultural contexts. The patterns were remarkably consistent across different denominations and different countries. Institutional self-protection, taking priority over victim safety, spiritual language being used to manipulate and silence, survivors being blamed for misunderstanding or provoking their abusers. But I also discovered inspiring examples of religious communities that were taking accountability seriously and implementing genuine reforms to prevent abuse and support survivors. Some Catholic dioceses had established independent review boards with significant lay participation. Some Protestant denominations had created mandatory reporting policies that prioritized child safety over institutional reputation. Some individual clergy members were courageously speaking out against the culture of silence and demanding systemic change from within their own institutions. These positive developments gave me hope that the work we were doing was making a real difference, not just for individual survivors, but for the broader project of making religious communities safer and more accountable. The young women and men entering religious life today would have protections and resources that hadn't existed during my time in the convent. Children in religious schools and youth programs would be less vulnerable to predators because of improved screening, training, and oversight policies. In 2010, 37 years after leaving the convent, I received a letter that brought my journey of healing and advocacy full circle. It was from Rebecca, the 14-year-old girl whose protection had cost me my religious vocation all those decades earlier. She was now a successful attorney specializing in cases involving institutional abuse, married with children of her own, and writing to thank me for the courage I had shown in speaking up when the adults in authority had failed to protect her. "Sister Catherine," she wrote, still using the title that I had lost so many years before, "I want you to know that not a day goes by that I don't thank God for putting you in my path when I needed protection most." The trauma of what Father Thomas did to me was real and significant, but it would have been so much worse if you hadn't found the strength to break your silence and fight for my safety. Your courage didn't just save me from further abuse. It taught me that protecting vulnerable people is more important than protecting powerful institutions, a lesson that has guided my entire legal career. She went on to tell me that she had followed my advocacy work over the years and had used the educational materials our organization developed in her own practice representing survivors of institutional abuse. She credited our resources with helping her understand her own experience and with giving her tools to help other survivors navigate legal and therapeutic processes. Reading her letter, I finally understood something that had taken me nearly 4 decades to fully grasp. The young sister who had walked out of St. Mary's Convent in 1973 hadn't lost her religious vocation. She had simply discovered that true service to God sometimes requires rejecting the human institutions that claim to represent divine authority. The work I had been doing for all these years, helping survivors heal and fighting for accountability and reform, had been every bit as sacred as anything I had done during my years behind convent walls. As I finish sharing this story with all of you wonderful people who have stayed with me through this long and sometimes painful journey, I want you to know how grateful I am for your attention, your comments, your support, and your own courage in facing difficult truths. Whether you're watching from London or Los Angeles, from Sydney or São Paulo, from Toronto or Tokyo, you've become part of a global community of people who refuse to let abuse hide behind religious authority. If my story has resonated with your own experiences, please know that you're not alone and that healing is possible, even when the damage feels overwhelming. If you're currently in a situation where someone in religious authority is making you uncomfortable or violating boundaries, trust your instincts and seek help from people outside that institutional structure. If you're a parent or community member who wants to better protect the children in your care, educate yourself about grooming behaviors and institutional warning signs. Most importantly, remember that God's love is not limited to human institutions, no matter how ancient, powerful, or supposedly sacred they claim to be. The divine presence that I encountered in prayer and service during my convent years was real, but it was never confined to those walls or controlled by those authorities. That same presence has been with me every step of my journey since leaving, blessing my marriage, my advocacy work, my friendships, and my continuing search for truth and justice. Thank you for letting me share this story with you. Thank you for creating a space where survivors can speak their truth without shame. Thank you for being the kind of people who care more about protecting the vulnerable than protecting powerful institutions. Please keep sharing your own stories in the comments, keep supporting each other, and keep believing that change is possible when people of conscience refuse to stay silent. Until we meet again, may you find the courage to trust your own moral compass, even when it leads you away from paths that others expect you to follow. And may you always remember that the most sacred thing you can do is protect those who cannot protect themselves, regardless of what it might cost you.